So I'm going to begin to talk a little bit, give a little bit of history about the ITIN and some of the most recent changes. So several changes have been made to the ITIN application and process since its inception in 1996. Since 2003, the IRS began to tighten its standards for issuing ITINs by requiring tax returns as proof that the ITIN would be used for tax administration purposes. But since the passage of the Tax Hike Act of 2015, or the PATH Act, ITINs that have not been used on a federal tax return at least once in the last 3 years are no longer valid for use on a tax return unless renewed by a taxpayer. In addition, ITINs issued prior to 2013 and not used on a federal tax return in the last 3 years need to be renewed starting October of last year based on a rolling renewal schedule. And starting in summer of 2016, so summer of last year, the IRS began mailing letter 5821 to individuals holding ITINs with the middle digits of 78 or 79, informing the individuals that they need to renew their ITIN. So as you can see on the slide, you can see an example of what numbers are up for renewal. So some of the most frequently asked questions in relation to the ITIN, the renewal of ITINs are, so what happens once an ITIN is renewed? So once an ITIN is renewed, an ITIN will remain in effect unless it is not used in a tax return for 3 consecutive years. And so what happens if you don't renew your ITIN? So some individuals may actually not be aware that their ITIN has expired or that they must renew an expired ITIN. According to the IRS, returns filed by these individuals will be accepted by the IRS. However, there may be a delay in processing some of the returns and credits, such as the Child Tax Credit and the American Opportunity Tax Credit. This could result in a reduced refund or additional penalties and interests. The IRS will notify these filers about the delay and any reduction in refunds and credits claimed, and will inform them about the need to file Form W-7 to renew their ITIN. In addition, according to the National Immigration Law Center, or NILC, the disadvantage to not renewing is that an individual who earns the threshold amount of income in a tax year that triggers the filing requirement is required by law to file a tax return, and we need an ITIN to do so. Records of tax filings can also be helpful and are actually sometimes sought by immigration law judges during the immigration adjustment process. So for more information on the benefits for immigrants of filing and income tax returns, you can check out NILC's guide, Individual Taxpayer Identification Number, a powerful tool for immigrant taxpayers. So the ITIN information is partially protected by Internal Revenue Code 6103, which generally prohibits the IRS from disclosing taxpayer information, including to other federal agencies. However, there are important exceptions that everyone should be aware of. In general, the IRS is required to disclose taxpayer information to state agencies responsible for tax administration, to law enforcement agencies for investigation and prosecution of non-tax criminal laws, or to powers of attorney and other designees. It's important to note, for the most part, under current law, information on the ITIN is protected from being shared with other federal agencies, including immigration agencies. According to NILC, to change the confidentiality of tax-related information, including ITIN information, Congress would have to change the law, as the confidentiality protections are codified in the IRS Code 6103. The IRS historically has been very invested in maintaining the confidentiality of its information, since the IRS does not want to see the reduction in tax revenue that would result if the confidentiality protections were weakened. Therefore, undocumented immigrants should note that there is some risk associated with applying and filing for an ITIN. An individual with an expired ITIN who has obtained or become eligible for a Social Security, for example through DACA, should not renew the ITIN and should discontinue using it. It is actually improper to be using both the ITIN and the Social Security number assigned to the same person to file tax returns. It is your responsibility to notify the IRS so it can combine all of your tax records under one identification number. If you do not notify the IRS when you are assigned a Social Security number, you may not receive credit for all the wages paid and taxes withheld, which could reduce the amount of any refund due. Individuals who become eligible to obtain a Social Security number, so for example, DACA recipients or permanent residents, should obtain a Social Security number from the Social Security Administration, or write a letter explaining that you now have been assigned a Social Security number and when your tax records combined. And in addition to sending a letter to the IRS, you may also send letters to the credit agencies requesting to change your ITIN to a Social Security number.